We're going to look now at Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground. And this is a classic piece of existential literature. It's kind of a hybrid between a confession, a philosophical treatise, and a short story written from the first-person perspective. It's been very influential on the development of later existentialist thought. It gets cited quite often, and it's even had some importance outside of existentialism per se, particularly because of some of the striking images, like the Crystal Palace, that are worked out in this piece. So, why is it, though, an important existentialist text? That's worth reflecting on before we dig into it. Is this a representation of the existentialist stance towards the self, towards the world, towards reality, towards emotions, towards rationality, towards culture and society, towards relations between people? Yes and no. I don't think that you can actually say that there's one single existentialist stance. This is a point that various writers have made within the existentialist movement in talking about the existentialist movement. It doesn't seem possible to pin everything down very neatly and to say, here is the one example. Already in the beginning, we have Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, and Nietzsche as these seminal figures, and they're quite different from each other. Is it then a typical existentialist stance? It is a typical existentialist stance we're going to see. Not necessarily the one single one, but a typical stance. And that's part of why it's got the importance that it does. Like I said, some of the other importance stems from its stock of images, like the Crystal Palace that we'll look at later. One of the things that I think we have to ask at the beginning, that's going to run through this entirely, and which the character himself is in some ways trying to work out, is who is this underground man? Who is this character? Who is this narrator? Who is this person? And one thing that I want to caution you about right from the start is identifying the underground man with Dostoevsky himself. Sometimes this takes place. It's important to see that the character is not necessarily the author. The character is not necessarily just a mouthpiece for the author. A similar mistake gets made by people who only read Albert Camus' The Stranger, and they assume that the stance, the attitudes, the sentiments, the ideas of the main character in that piece express who Camus is and what his views are on things. With Dostoevsky, it's a little bit harder to pin down. Part of his genius seems to have been actually spitting out characters who represent coherent perspectives but are not necessarily him, and putting them into play with each other and working out sort of ethical, moral, existential dilemmas. So we don't want to identify Dostoevsky very clearly with this. So what's he doing? He is exploring the self and human nature through a particular person, a kind of type. Not necessarily humanity as such. He's not saying this one guy is the image of all human beings, or even the most authentic human being. He frames things, and this is where we can ask, so if the character isn't Dostoevsky himself, is this just a literary fiction? Is this just like him playing around with things? And Dostoevsky tells us a few things. Not much, but just a very few things. There's a footnote where Dostoevsky, as the author, writes, "It goes without saying that both these notes and their author are fictitious. Nevertheless, people like the author of these notes may and indeed must exist in our society. if we think of the circumstances under which that society has been formed. It's been my wish to show the public a character of the recent past more clearly than is usually shown. He belongs to the generation that is now rounding out its days. In the excerpt entitled The Mousehole, this man introduces himself and presents his views, trying to explain why he has appeared and could not help but appear in our midst. The next excerpt consists of this man's actual notes relating to certain events in his life. So he's adopting this literary fiction, this literary device of saying, I found, he's not saying I found these notes and I'm replicating them, but something like this ought to be the case. In a way, it reminds me a little bit of Thucydides. If you've read Thucydides, the great Greek historian, he recounts a lot of speeches. One of the things that he says about his you might say, process of quotation is, I'm not actually giving you these speeches verbatim exactly as they were said. I'm giving you sometimes what the characters ought to have said, given the kind of person who they were. So Creon may not have actually said the things that Thucydides says, that he reports that he said, but he said something like it, and he said something along those lines because Creon was the kind of guy to do that. At the very end, Dostoevsky also tells us, and this is kind of interesting, he says, actually, the notes of this lover of paradoxes do not end here. He couldn't resist and went on writing, but we are of the opinion that one might just as well stop here. So Dostoevsky, he's doing something very interesting here. He's saying, well, the writer of these notes, and now he's not saying, oh yeah, this is the kind of thing that I'm making up because it would have come on the scene. Now he's actually presenting it as if I do have these notes in front of me and I'm just copying them for you, the reader. And he says, they keep going on and on and on. They should have stopped here because the person says, that's enough, I've had enough of writing these notes from the underground. That's the last thing from the underground man to say. The notes themselves, the genre, if you had to pick a genre that it fits closest to, is a confession. And the writer actually brings this up a couple of times. He says, I'm trying to put matters down, I'm trying to make sense of them, I'm trying to he doesn't say wrap my head around them, but that's the sort of way we would talk about it now. He talks about these as being admissions. And here we go. He says, I've taken a fancy into my head and I want to realize it at any cost. I've got a whim and I'm going to follow that through. What I mean is there are things in every man's past that he won't admit except to his most intimate friends. There are other things that he won't admit even to his friends, but only to himself, and only in strictest confidence. But there are things, too, a man won't dare to admit even to himself, and every decent man has quite an accumulation of such things. In fact, the more decent he is, the greater the accumulation he's bound to have. I have only recently dared to explore some of my past adventures, which until then I had avoided with peculiar anxiety. But now that I have made myself remember them and have even dared to write them down, I want to make a test to see whether it is possible to be completely frank and unafraid of the whole truth. I would like to note here, as Heinz remarked to the effect that sincere autobiographies are almost impossible and a man is bound to lie about himself. I'm sure Heine is right. But Heine was passing judgment on a man confessing publicly. Now, in my case, I'm writing this just for myself. For even if I do address myself to imaginary readers, I do it only because it makes it easier for me to write. It's a matter of form, nothing else. For as I said before, I'll never have any readers. So, there's a lot of paradoxes involved here, aren't there? And we don't have to explore those in great depth, but it's worth pointing them out. Is Dostoevsky expecting a reader for this? Is the guy who's actually talking expecting a reader? He's addressing readers, but now it looks as if he's doing that just so he can kind of pull the truth out of himself. And so that's one paradox. The other one is, it consists in a word. He says, unafraid. Unafraid of the whole truth. So, what's one of the most common affects that you see running through this story? Fear. Anxiety. Fear of all sorts of things. Along with that, cowardice and courage. So, this guy, by laying out on paper his moments of cowardice, is being unafraid. Is that yet another way of trying to sort of console himself and make him feel like he's not a coward when he really is a coward? Or is there a greater sense of courage here that trumps other courage, the kind of courage that we tend to respect and look at as being instances of the type? But wouldn't that be very much along the lines that you could expect that a bitter, impotent intellectual who's disdainful of people of action and spontaneity might say as a response to try to elevate their own kind of courage over that of others? It's sort of like the, well, I'm less of a hypocrite because I confess that I'm a hypocrite and we're all hypocrites. There's, you know, on the one hand, there's a sort of ring of truth to that, and on the other hand, sort of a tone of insincerity. So again, another paradox. Let's talk now about, we'll go back to who this guy is, but talk about how Dostoevsky put this together, since we're talking about literary composition. There's two parts to this. If we take out the narrative framing that Dostoevsky himself is putting in, with these little, you know, notes at the beginning and end. The first part is the mouse hole, and that is, it starts out as seeming to be kind of rambling and recounting who he is, and then it starts to get more and more and more philosophical, and eventually reaches a peak of essentially being something like a philosophical treatise. It's still addressed to a reader, however, so there's a dialectical or dialogical element to it. There's that, and then the entire second half is a story about how this guy, you know, got involved in these, as he calls them, adventures, during the course of which he borrows some money, meets up with some old school acquaintances, goes to a dinner with them, neglects to pay his servant for the time being, makes an ass of himself at dinner for reasons that we can talk about later, goes off to a brothel, meets a prostitute, has a long conversation with her, gives her his address, leaves, has a few days pass, and then she comes to his place and they have another interaction, which turns out in large respect quite badly for both of them. Those are the sort of things that he's talking about. That's the how did he put it? Things that a person won't even admit to his friends or to himself. Every decent man is quite an accumulation of such things. And these are his past adventures which he had avoided with peculiar anxiety. He doesn't want to think about these things and what it says about himself, and the pointlessness or failure of what he's doing and the way that he's living. So, all that said, let's go back to this. Who is this guy? What does he tell us about himself? There is some biography in this. It's all autobiography. I'm not sure exactly how much we ought to trust it, but all we have to go on is what he gives us. So we can ask about his biography, the facts about him, and then we can ask about his character. What do we know? He's an orphan. We know that. He talks about growing up without parents. He went to school. There he met a lot of people. He seems to have excelled in what we might call abstract or scholastic kind of studies, and was singled out. Then he entered government service. He actually entered it in order to make a living, and then transferred from one department to another, he says, so he could get away from his former schoolmates. So he's a guy who, and this goes from biography to character, he's the kind of guy who leaves things behind. You might say unfinished. He works as a government employee for a while, as a clerk, and then after he receives a small inheritance, he quits and he moves to an apartment in the city of Petersburg, where he was located before. He really can't afford it that well. He has to scrape by. He could live in a place that's cheaper, but he chooses to live in Petersburg, in a not so great area of town. And he essentially lives on this inheritance. So he doesn't really do much of anything at that point. He talks of his office head, Anton Antonich, as his only acquaintance. And he is a pretty isolated man. It's not really correct to say that that's his only acquaintance, because if we look at the story, he runs across other people who he knows, who he remembers from school. He also has a servant who he doesn't get along with very well, quite frankly. His servant doesn't appear to be a particularly good type either, but it would be hard to work for a guy like this, so I can just imagine, what the interactions would be like. He's pretty isolated. He's a thinker, he's an intellectual. He's not extremely practical, but he is able to get quite a few things done. He's able to borrow money from people, for one thing. He manages to keep things more or less straight, so he's not just a dreamer with his head in the clouds. But like he says, his action is infected with ideas. And one of the things that I think is really telling about it, goes to character. He is an intellectual. He can't stop thinking. He thinks too much in the wrong ways. He engages in reflection that doesn't generate an awful lot of understanding. It's as if no matter what you say to the guy, he's always got one more thing to say that's being suggested to him, that's popping into his head. But there's an insecurity there about his capacity to think. Not only, a sense of futility, like, well, what the hell is all this for? Other people seem to be succeeding quite better than me, and being an intellectual does not seem to make you particularly happy compared to being a person of action. But he actually seems to be very concerned that other people think of him as an intellectual. So here's a great, he's going into an office and he says, "Let my face be plain, I thought, as long as it's dignified, expressive, and above all, incredibly intelligent. I was painfully aware, however, that my facial expression could not possibly convey all these qualities. And worse yet, while I'd have settled for anything, as long as it looked intelligent, I found my face positively stupid. I'd have even accepted a depraved expression if at the same time everyone had agreed, I love that line, that I had a terribly intelligent face." So this is a guy who he is an intellectual. He is a thinker. He can't escape that. He does have talent. But he wants other people that he seems not to care at all about. He wants other people to think of him not only as intelligent, but as terribly intelligent, and as that even being written on his face. So there is a fundamental insecurity there, I think. Something that can't possibly be satisfied, right? So he says that, and again, this goes to his character. he says he's really painfully sensitive and complex as a man of this age should be. What does he mean by this age? He means an age which is becoming enlightened, in which people are no longer relating to each other just in terms of feudal relations or economic relations, or during wartime. I mean, Russia had gone through some pretty tough times, just half a century before. But they're relating to each other in other ways. The world of the mind has penetrated the other world, so to speak. He lacks a stable sense of who or what he is. He lacks persistence or perseverance or consistency. He talks about this in terms of not being able to stick to things, and yet not even being lazy in the sense of being able to say, that guy's a lazy guy, and being able to say, now I know what he is, who he is. So this is a real problem for him. He says, he's never able to even follow through on revenge. And he gives some examples of that. So, he's also capable of decent human interactions. And he doesn't do that. He does do them sometimes. But he can't be relied upon to continue doing them. He can't be relied upon to consistently behave like a decent human being. So every once in a while he'll just say something cruel, biting. For instance, when he's at the retirement dinner for his friend, well, not his friend, but his acquaintance from school, and he throws in there a barb about, this person, of course, this person who's retired is talking about what a great guy he is, he's doing lots of name dropping. And so the underground man says, yeah, how come so-and-so didn't come to your party? And it's not just committing a faux pas. There's a maliciousness involved. But not a maliciousness like, man, I'm going to get that guy. All right, here comes my chance. Now I got him. More like, oh, there's a chance to do something mean. All right, I'll do it. So that's part of his character. What are his typical moods? We're going to talk a little bit more about this and different affects later, but let's note right now that part of his character, central part of his character, the moods that you see him talking about the most are on two different ends. One is fear, anxiety, concern about what people are going to think, and perhaps a sense of shame. The other is resentment, irritation, maliciousness. These are most of his range of feelings. He does also talk about joy. He also talks about desire. But the two main stars in the constellation are, I think, anger and fear. He makes some remarks about reading that are somewhat relevant, about dissolution, and we're going to look at that in just a moment. He also talks about love, and so here we're focusing on his character, and there are certain passages that are very revealing. So let's look at why reading is so important to this guy. I mean, you can understand, for an intellectual, reading would be at the center of who he is. But there are different ways of reading. The spiritual reading that a monk does each day, Lectio Divina, is something very different than the kind of reading that he's doing. The reading that somebody does to study to pass the bar exam after going through law school is very different than the kind of reading that he's talking about. So he says, at home I mostly read. I had to drown out the clamor in me, and reading was the only available way. So there's a clamor inside of him. There's a disquiet, a restlessness inside of him. And reading is a way to take care of that. And I think we know a lot of people, maybe some of us are like that ourselves at times, who read to escape. And so long as we can fix our minds on somebody else's story, some other issue, we are led away from looking at ourselves and our own turmoil and trials and failures and missed opportunities and regrets and things like that. So it says, reading, of course, was helpful. It stirred, delight, and tormented me. Now and then, however, I grew terribly tired of it. I became restless and plunged not into real debauchery, but into murky, sordid, petty dissipation. My petty passion stabbed and burned me because I was already on edge. I suffered hysterical outbursts of tears and convulsions. So this is a guy who breaks down every so often by himself in his apartment. You know, he does actually have a crying jag in the arms of the prostitute later on in the story, but that doesn't seem to be typically what happens. Not into real debauchery. He doesn't count going to the whorehouse as real debauchery, although you can tell he does that from time to time because he talks about when he goes to the brothel, this being a place that he knows already, but into murky, sordid, petty dissipation. Aside from my reading, I had nothing to turn to, for there was nothing in my surroundings that I could look up to or that attracted me. I was sick of everything and longed to contradict and oppose. Longed to contradict and oppose. That's another key element of who this guy is. And it leads to what his biography is, the facts of him. Because the fact is, he says things to people to tick them off, or to show them that he's not seeing things the same way as them, or that he has some power over them, or they're not going to make him do things their way. We'll see why in a little while, why that's such a strong urge in him. So, it says, I abandoned myself to dissipation. I indulged in vice at night, steadily, fearfully, sordidly. The feeling of shame was always present, and in the most unspeakable moments, it was like damnation itself. Even then, I carried this hole in the floor of my heart. That's a beautiful expression, isn't it? Of an ugly thing. Even then, I carried this hole in the floor of my heart. I was terribly afraid to be seen and recognized, and I went to the lowest haunts. So he did engage in some vice. What were his vices? Probably the typical things that people do. Drinking, to excess, getting into arguments, talking, just for the sake of talking, gossiping, lying to people, pickups, one-night stands, those sorts of things. He actually gives us this funny incident. Once passing by a tavern, I saw some men fighting with billiard cues through a lighted window. One of them was tossed out with the window. I envied the ejected gentleman so much I entered the tavern and stepped into the billiard room thinking maybe I could pick a fight too and be thrown out the window. And then he talks about this whole thing with this officer who treats him like an object. But what else is going on? So he's going to talk about reading some more later on. Reading is an escape for him from his life, in which he's not entirely inactive. He is actually out there pursuing these sort of petty, sordid pleasures. What about love? Well, that's where we get back to reading again. Reading and dreaming. He says that he resigned himself sometimes. I had an escape that made everything bearable. I took refuge in the sublime and the beautiful. In my dreams, of course. I gave myself over entirely to dreaming away for 3 months on end, huddled in my corner. And believe me, in my dreams I had nothing in common with who I am, right? My dreams were sweeter and stronger after my petty dissipations and were accompanied by remorse, tears, cursing, and ecstasy. I experienced moments of actual intoxication, and I swear was happy without finding it in the least ridiculous. That's a strange thing to say, too, to be happy without finding your happiness ridiculous. This is a man who is, in some respect, afraid of happiness, isn't it? I had faith, hope, love, the three theological virtues, right? So what are we talking about here? Part of this is, he's a guy who, does these small sins, these small faults, and then afterwards, in his dreams, arranges them into some sort of narrative, presumably of like repentance and conversion, and we can well imagine him like, conversing with angels and saints in these dreams, and expecting, God to say, you are, on the right side, finally, I've been searching for you. All those sorts of images, right? That's just it. I had blind faith that by some miracle, some force would push aside the confining screen, opening up a wide horizon on which would be a worthwhile life work, useful and sublime, and above all cut out and waiting for me. I didn't know what kind of work it should be, but it was essential that it should be there, ready and waiting for me to perform it. Now, that's a really interesting thing to go. To go from, these sort of religious views and all that, which, if you're really being religious, humility is essential to that. And part of humility is being able to say, I go where I have to because, that's where God wants me, and I'm really not that important. What does he dream about? He dreams about being important. He dreams about having things fall into place, about, like he says, horizons opening up and a task being set out for me that is mine and mine alone, my purpose, that which will make me be someone who matters, who's able to step in and do those sorts of things. Useful and sublime. Useful for other people and yet sublime, elevated, noble. Could be to fall in love with somebody, to make their life wonderful. It could be to, engage in some sort of magnificent gestures. It could be to save the nation through policing the streets or routing the enemy. Or it could be any sort of thing like that. It could be a victory in the life of the mind. Like he says, I couldn't even conceive of being second best. That's why in real life I resign myself so easily to being last. If he can't have the top, then screw it all. And you've seen people like this, right? The more and more that we recount this person, the less and less this seems like just a literary invention on Dostoevsky's part. I had to be either a hero or wallow in the mud, and that's what turned out to be my undoing. For while wallowing in the mud, I'd console myself that at other times I was a hero. That made it all right. So this is a way of escape for him again. And again, he says, it's noteworthy I usually thought of the sublime and the beautiful during my dissipation, often just when I hit the rock bottom of objection. Then these thoughts came in little flashes as if to remind me of the existence of the sublime and the beautiful. But they didn't interfere with my dissipation. Just the opposite, in fact. They seemed to spice it up by contrast, and like a good sauce, help to bring out the taste. So, I mean, like, right while he's doing bad things, he's thinking to himself these dreams. This sauce concocted of contradictions and suffering contained painful self-analysis, and the resulting agonies and torments added piquancy and even meaning to my dissipation. In short, it was what a good sauce is meant to be. There was more to it, though, for without the sauce, I could hardly have borne the primitive, vulgar, uncomplicated dissipation of a petty government employee and the soiled feeling that it left. Could any vice have drawn me into the street at night otherwise? No, but then I had the sauce. So it's interesting. He's claiming that because he's got these moments of dreaming and of thinking of himself as being this imaginary hero and that things are going to open up for him, that somehow that's what enables him. That doesn't just help him get him through the day. That's what actually enables him to go out at night and get drunk and get laid. because otherwise he wouldn't maybe have the heart for that. Now, we get to another very important point. How much love I experienced in my dreams when I escaped to the sublime and beautiful. Perhaps it was an imaginary love, and maybe it was never directed toward another human being, but it was such an overflowing love, there was no need to direct it. That would have been an unnecessary luxury. So he feels this affect of love, and it's not for anything in particular. It's just a sense of love, and to single in on any one thing, he says, would have been a luxury. Everything always ended safely in a leisurely rapture sliding into the domain of art, that is, into the beautiful lives of heroes stolen from the authors of novels and poems and adapted to the demands of the moment, whatever they might be. I, for instance, triumph over everyone, and they are, of course, strewn in the dust, acknowledging my superiority. I'm all forgiving. I'm a great poet and court chamberlain. I fall in love. I inherit millions and donate them to human causes, and take advantage of this opportunity to publicly confess my backslidings and disgrace, which of course is no ordinary disgrace, but contains much that is sublime and beautiful in it. Everyone is weeping and kissing me. Then I leave hungry and barefoot to preach new ideas and rout the reactionaries at Austerlitz. So again, these grandiose ideas about what he's going to do, and it's interesting, you notice that, okay, I'm talking about love, and I feel this love for everybody, and it's reaching out towards everything. And then very quickly it starts to become about the self. And it's less about my expression of love for these other people, and it's more about how they love me. I'm such a lovable person. And that's really what this guy is lacking at his heart. He does not feel, in any sense, loved. His own sense of love, what love consists in, is, it's very problematic, to say the least. Let me read you a passage. He sees a person who actually loves in this prostitute, when he breaks down himself. He goes into this long speech about her where he's essentially rejecting her on every different level. And he says, at this point a very strange thing happened. I was so used to imagining everything happening the way it does in books. I didn't pay attention to what was going on. What actually happened was that Liza, who I had humiliated and crushed, understood much more than I had thought. Out of all that I had said, she had understood what a sincerely loving woman would understand first, that I myself was unhappy. Notice, he's able to see her as a sincerely loving woman because of her action towards him. So it's not as if he's totally blind to what love consists in. But what shape can love take for him as he's giving it to other people? He says, I couldn't fall in love because for me, loving means bullying and dominating. I have never been able to imagine any other way of loving and have reached a point where, to me, love consists of a voluntary concession by the object of my love, of my right to bully it. Even dreaming in my mouse hole, I'd never visualized love as anything but a struggle, starting with hatred and ending in the subjection of a loved object, after which I was unable to think of anything. So this is love as desire. It's not even desire it's not even eros, like the desire to have sex, or the desire to, more contemplative, to just be in the same presence of the person. For him, to love means to dominate, to bully. And he can tell that things are going well with him when the loved object permits him to bully him. This actually reminds me of an earlier passage where he talks about having a acquaintance in school. He was not liked by most of the other kids, but he was liked by another kid until he bullied him. And he told him that it had to be either him and this other kid against everyone else, or nothing. That was a chance for him to do something different. And what's interesting, particularly interesting about this, he's able to recognize that's not all there is to love, but that's all there is to love for him. The key issue that we've been moving towards here, the central point around which all of this turns, is that there's a disconnect for the underground man, as for all of us, but it's the way that he handles it that matters. There's a disconnect between how things are ideally, how they ought to be, how they're represented, for example, in books, in dreams, in plans, in our intentions, in our hopes, our aspirations, and then how they actually turn out to be in reality. And an integrated person is able not only to be integrated within themselves, but to integrate those dreams, hopes, and all that with the reality. There's two ways of not being integrated well when it comes to this, two fundamental ways. One is to give in to reality and say, hey, that's the way it is. It's dog eat dog, screw everyone. I'm just going to be like these people over here, figure out how to get along. And all those hopes, dreams, and indeed loves go out the window as being unrealistic. That's to kill part of yourself. And to kill actually the sublime and the beautiful, right? A very good part of yourself. That true maybe has to be, tempered to some degree, and we have to get to know through books that are kind of misleading sometimes, and in our case movies and love songs and things like that. The other way is to do what the underground man, and to take refuge in this ideality, which it ends up being threadbare. He's not the kind of idealist who believes his BS, believes his ideology, and makes reality conform to it. To do that would be a man of action, right? He's one who wants that ideality to be reality, can't make it so, and hates reality as a result in response. Now, is this the human condition? This is the human condition in many respects for many people. What you can say about the underground man is he's not depicting the human condition as such for all human beings. What he's rather showing you is a response that many people take to the problem of the relationship between this realm of hopes, dreams, loves, and the reality that does not conform to it. And what happens when it's not integrated. So now let's talk about some of the more even philosophical meat having to do with reason, passion, desire, and happiness, practical rationality. There's this long, essentially diatribe carried out in dialogue against an Enlightenment scientific way of seeing things. And so let's start with the starting problem. Why does the good and the beautiful, the classic values, not only of the Enlightenment, but of philosophy, literature, civilization in general, why do they set us off the rails? He says, the more conscious I was of the good and beautiful, the deeper I sank into the mud, and the more likely I was to remain mired in it. That was my normal state. Something gnawed at me, tore at myself and ate myself away until the bitterness turned into some shameful, accursed sweetishness, and finally into a great unquestionable pleasure. Why is it that some people can actually take pleasure, like he says, in the blinding realization of my degradation? How can somebody find the ugly and the bad to be good and beautiful, to be pleasant? What's the explanation for this pleasure, he says? He's got a discussion of revenge, and he talks about the man of action and the intellectual's response to situations of revenge. Why do we want revenge? Well, we feel like somebody has offended us. Somebody did something to us. They said something. They hurt us in some way. They overlooked us. They treated us in a way that we didn't want to be treated. The man of action gets offended and then desires revenge, tries to take revenge if they can. And they see all of that as just, right? If they didn't see it as just, or if somebody comes along and tells them that's not the right thing to do, and they actually believe it, then they say, oh, okay, I guess I won't do it then. That's what he talks about as like a stone wall. You know, if the man of action, if you put a stone wall in front of him, he just stops right there, and now he's sort of content. Sort of like a horse or a cow when you put up a fence. They don't usually jump over the fence. Once they get used to it, they're like, well, a fence there, I'll go over here where there isn't a fence, you know. The intellectual wants to get revenge as well. And they get offended even easier because they have a much easier time taking offense, right? They're able to read into things so much easier. They'll even get offended at the other person not realizing that they offended the intellectual. So how could you not know that that would be offensive to me? And again, boy, you know, you could think of a lot of people like that, you know, who are just rancorous and surprised that you didn't know that this was offensive to them. And, you know, it seems like it changes every 5 years or so. Now you should not talk about this subject, or don't use this word, and they'll get so angry with you. But they get angry with you, and they will, you know, raise their voice and use words, you know, call you hateful, and, you know, maybe shake their fist or something like that. Will they actually punch you out? Not really, because they're not men of action or women of action, right? Real men and women of action, they'll punch you out. If they don't like what you're saying, they'll pop you in the face, you know. And then quite often, you know, things can get worked out. The intellectual just sort of lets it fester there, and they take indirect revenge. They wait until they can do it, and they find little ways to be, you know, snide and sneaky and snarky and all that. And here's where it's really interesting. Yeah, that's a classic contrast between open revenge and passive-aggressive revenge, right? Like I said before, the man of action, for Dostoevsky here, thinks that what he's doing is just. I mean, he might be wrong about that, but he feels that it's just. The intellectual feels that it's not just, that in some ways they're just as bad as the person who offended them. And they find themselves doing something bad in the process to get revenge, and that makes them feel even worse. You know, this goes all the way back to Plato and, you know, the consciousness of badness. If a bad person actually realizes the badness of their actions, they're being punished already in that, and they can't escape that. So, nevertheless, they keep on with all of it. Like he says too, when it comes to, like, you know, the laws of nature, or, you know, stone walls, or 2 + 2 = 4, the man of action stops short before that. So, okay, there's a wall. The intellectual can't knock the wall down, can't refute it, but like he says, won't accept it. That's a key idea here. The intellectual, part of their reflective process is not to actually leap beyond it in a heroic way, but to say, I'm not going to accept it. I don't like it. I don't have to put up with it. I don't have to agree with it. So, let's look at this issue then of being rational, recognizing, as he says, your real interests. And the Enlightenment idea. Or approach. It focuses on being rational, on recognizing one's real interests, as he says. There's a set of you know, arguments basically following from each other. And he he lays out sort of a caricature. He says, who was it that first said that man does nasty things only because he doesn't know where his real interests lie? That if he were enlightened about his true interests, he would immediately stop acting like a pig and become kind and noble. Being enlightened, the argument goes on, and seeing where his real advantage lie, he would realize it was in acting virtuously. And since it's well established a man will not act deliberately against his own interests, it follows he would have no choice but to become good. And that's pretty much it for the Enlightenment, right? If you just knew what your real interests were and what it meant to be a good, flourishing human being, you'd knock off all your BS and immediately start working on yourself and try to be good and rational and maybe even pure and make the rest of the world like that too. So Dostoevsky brings up three problems with that. Problem one is, he says, when do we act exclusively out of self-interest? Problem two is, can you define what actually is in the interests of a human being? Problem three is, what if the interest is something, something bad, harmful, ugly? So these are three big problems. I mean, if the Enlightenment viewpoint could actually take into account all of these things and somehow suck them in and chew them up and make sense of them and address them fully, then it would be okay. But it actually can't. And so it's interesting. There's kind of a seduction on the part of reason about how great reason is. So Dostoevsky says this. He says, here we go. All these lovely systems, all these theories that explain to man what is to his true advantage so that to achieve it he will forthwith become good and noble, all these are, in my opinion, nothing but sterile exercises in logic. Yes, that's all there is to it. Men love abstract reasoning and neat systemization so much that they think they're nothing of distorting the truth, closing their eyes and ears to contrary evidence to preserve their logical constructions. Here's an example. As mankind becomes more enlightened, they should become less bloodthirsty, more civilized. Now, this is before World War I, where a lot of European intellectuals then said, oh my gosh, there was something wrong with that idea. Dostoevsky says, you only have to look around you and you see blood being spilled in the most playful way, just as if it were champagne. Look at the United States, that indissoluble union plunged into civil war, the most bloody war in our history yet, still. And the most brutal war that we've ever been involved in. What is it that it's mellowed by civilization? All it does, I'd say, is to develop in man a capacity to feel a greater variety of sensation. Nothing else. And through this development, man will learn how to enjoy bloodshed. That leads us to the third problem, right? What if our genuine interests are bad things? He also talks about reason as well. He says, I admit reason is a good thing. No argument about that, but reason is only reason, and it only satisfies man's rational requirements. Desire, on the other hand, is the manifestation of life itself, of all of life, and it encompasses everything from reason down to scratching oneself. Although when we're guided by our desires, life may turn into a messy affair, it's still life and not a series of extractions of square roots. I, for instance, instinctively want to live, to exercise all the aspects of life in me and not only reason, which amounts to maybe only 1/20 of the whole. He also says, what does reason know? It only knows what it has learned. Is that everything? No. So, how do we actually know we're doing things exclusively out of self-interest? Is that just sort of a logical construction involved in theories that want to rationalize everything? They just roll everything into self-interest and sort of assume that it's there somewhere. Desire, if it wants to, can agree with reason, especially if one uses it sparingly, never going too far. Then desire is quite useful, even praiseworthy. But really, in reality, desire usually stubbornly disagrees with reason. And let me tell you that this is also useful and praiseworthy, he says. What about the scale? How do we actually measure the interest of the human being? How do you define what's in the interest of the human being? He says, interest. What interest? Can you define exactly what is in the interest of a human being? And suppose the interest of a man is not only consistent with, but even demands something harmful? Is there an accurate scale of human advantages? Aren't there any advantages that are omitted that cannot possibly be included in such a scale? And as far as I can understand, this is another point he's making, you've based your formulas, you've based your scale of advantages on statistical averages and scientific formulas thought up by economists. And since your scale consists of such advantages as happiness, prosperity, freedom, security, and all that, a man who just deliberately disregarded that scale will be branded by you as an obscurantist and utterly insane. What's really remarkable is that all your statisticians, sages, and humanitarians, when listing human advantages, insist on leaving out one of them. They never even allow for it, thus invalidating all their calculations. What advantage is that? Well, that's when we get to this. What if the interest of the human being actually were to have their own way, even if it's damaging to them, even if it's destructive? He says, perhaps there's something that every man values above the highest individual advantage, or there may exist a human advantage that is the most advantageous, which is also more important than the others, and for the sake of which a man, if need be, will go against reason, honor, security, and prosperity. In short, against all the beautiful and useful things. What is it? He says, it's not just a question of words. Before I name this advantage, let me go on and say that these other things don't fit. What is it? Man will give up erring of his own free will and stop opposing his will to his interests. Well, what is in his interests? Later on he says, one's own free, unrestrained choice, one's own whim, be it the wildest, one's own fancy, sometimes worked up to a frenzy, that is the most advantageous advantage that cannot be fitted into any table or scale, and that causes every system and every theory to crumble into dust on contact. So, all of this is undone by whim. Wanting to do things your own way. Wanting to be what you want to be. Even if it doesn't make sense. Even if it doesn't ultimately bring security, prosperity, honor, happiness. Even if it goes against these things, one can say no to what's being offered to you. This is the crystal palace, the enlightenment. That's where we're going to actually leave off with this. This image that he has of the crystal palace created by the men of science, where everything is light and truth and harmony and everything fits together. He says, you want to cure human beings of all of their problems. You want to lead us through engineering and science to this crystal palace in which everything will fit. and I'm going to stick my tongue out at it. And I want to be able to stick my tongue out at it. And I don't want a place which will turn me into an automaton where I wouldn't even think of sticking my tongue out at it. As he says, what I'm for is whim, and I want the right to use it whenever I want to. I know, for example, that suffering is inadmissible in light stage plays. In the utopian Crystal Palace, it would be inconceivable. For suffering means doubt and denial, and what kind of Crystal Palace would that be if people had doubts about it? Nevertheless, I'm certain that man will never give up true suffering. That is chaos and destruction. I know that he likes it and won't exchange it for any advantage. So, again, very typical existentialist piece in many respects. We've gotten ourselves to the point where we see that, at least for the underground man and the portrait of human beings that's being presented, it's not saying the Enlightenment isn't there, it's not saying these things aren't advantageous, it's saying this can't be brought within the scope of your system, and this is important. This is part of the essence of humanity. But how do you nail down whim? Could you come up with a catalog of them? It wouldn't be whim then, would it? It would go back into this Enlightenment, timetable, schedule sort of thing. So that's where we'll leave off in yet another important existential piece of literature by Fyodor Dostoevsky.